our relationship really goes back to Joe Matthews in seminary, in graduate school. I think Joe came there to Perkins in '52, and which is the same year Charles started to Perkins, and I started in '53. So he was there all the time we were there. And though, you know, we were not close to him personally necessarily at all, I think he so influenced what was going on in that seminary that we had to be influenced by it. After we graduated, he went down to Austin to the Christian Faith and Life community in '56. And we were over at a little town 40 miles northwest of Austin at that time. So we were in Austin often, and with Joe and Lynn at their home, did things with the Christian Faith and Life community when they would just have special speakers or something like that. And then we went to a town called Lyford down in the Lower Red Rhine Valley, and in our annual conference. And at this point, the Faith and Life community began to work. It had been a student thing before. It began to work with clergy and laity too. And so they began having seminars for both lay persons and clergy.
What year was that?
57, I believe.
Yeah, 57, 58, maybe.
Got it.
Yeah.
No, 58.
58.
58 or 59, yeah.
And so Charles went to the first clergy PMC, which was Parish Minister's Colloquy. And then the men who were in that said, look, what about our wives? This has really changed our whole world, and we need to have our wives in on this. So they set up a colloquy seminar, weekday seminar for wives of these guys. So, you know, our relationship to Joe Matthews and to what he gave birth to really goes back quite a long way.
Wow.
And he and a group of people left the Christian Faith and Life community in '62 and went to the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago.
Going to this this first PMC was over 4 months' time, and they did like 3 days, Monday to Wednesday, 1 week a month, and so they spread the RS1 and some other things out over that period of time, or what was to become the RS. And so now the wives' colloquy was a little not like that. It was but you did have additional ones in addition to the first one. I mean, one thing was a dramatic lecturer, and there was drama in what he did. It had impact. You know, not just intellectual impact, but, well, I guess it is of a kind, but anyway. And he would pace at the front of the room, and I remember one time he was going over against the wall and sort of banging on the wall to emphasize something. And
but the seminary was a major change in the seminary anyway at this point. They had just brought a new dean in. They had I mean, they came to a point in history when almost a complete new faculty emerged in just, what, 2 or 3 or 4 years?
Yes, right. They brought in they brought in some just great classical professors like William Warren Sweet, who taught church history at the University of Chicago. And he was emeritus, and he came down there, and I think he was able to help get Albert Outler and some other people to come there.
The Old Testament.
Oh yeah.
He was emeritus too from Chicago.
Yeah, an Old Testament professor from Chicago. And these were big names of the era. And
or of the past era, really.
Yeah, the past era. Right. But they enticed, got other people to come that were sort of on the edge of things. And
it sounds like they were out recruiting. I don't think that was it. People who were on the edge were interested because these men had come there.
Right.
You know, it was, and Joe, and out of this particular time, the whole curriculum got recreated. It was a huge
At Perkins.
At
Yes.
Perkins got, and so and Joe, I think, had a big part to play in redoing the curriculum. He had that kind of a mind that you know was thought in huge ways, and could see things in the context of the times that we were in. And so I think he had a big part to play in redoing the Perkins curriculum, which was in place by the time I got there in '53.
So when you arrived, the new curriculum was already
It was sort of the first year, I think, of the,
another aspect of this is just the times of what was happening then. After World War II, all these people came back from the war, and the war had so profoundly affected their interior being and made them start thinking about life differently, and what does it all mean, and this kind of thing. And they started going, the seminary just filled up with these
with World War II vets.
World War II vets, but many of them then had to go to undergraduate school first before they could get into seminary. And but it was a time of just ferment and just.
Their education was paid for because through the vets programs, so they were just.
The GI Bill was covering so many, and also after the war, there began to spring up these lay centers across Europe and in this country. Right at this moment, I can't pull up the names except well, in Scotland, the Iona community.
The Taizé community.
The Taizé community in Switzerland, France.
And then the academies.
Lay academies they call.
Well, the Ecumenical Institute, for one, in Switzerland.
in Switzerland, and then the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago, which was part of all of this.
And in Germany, there was a huge foment of theological reconsideration. Just, you know, you think, oh my gosh, the church must have been dead. No, it was just amazingly alive after the war, because people had to search their souls to the bottom.
I think I was like so many guys just recently out of seminary. You were still, I was like 4 years out of seminary, and I was still getting my feet on the ground and understanding of what to do and how to do and so forth. And this, I think, released me to see that I could just go ahead and do what I wanted to do and needed to do. And I think the Tillich paper, Paul Tillich's You Are Accepted, probably was the centerpiece of that for me. And for, it's interesting, a fellow pastor from the Lutheran church in the same town where we were, he went with me. And we went up there, and another pastor that you might know, Russell Moon, but he was a pastor not too far between where we were in Austin, and we went by and picked up Russell to go to this, and we talked about our experience of it, and I think the Tillich paper was the key freeing thing that was in the time for most of us. And
but they were experimenting with the use of art forms. Joe had done this in seminary too.
yeah,
In the seminary, he had used music like the Rite of Spring, things that were just not familiar to people's ears. I don't know what else, but that's one thing I do remember. Well, in Austin, same thing. They used college professors, an artist, I can't remember his name, but
yeah, I can't either, but
and some of his work, and they began to perfect what we later called the art form method, and now they call it something else. But and so he used things like that to address the interior deeps of people, and he was, you know, he was intellectually brutal. On the other hand, he was unbelievably tuned in to people's interior life and responses, and it's a little different. But I remember a couple of my roommates had a course under him, and I just remember they're talking about him and saying, on the one hand, he can just look right through you, and he would stare you down without ever blinking, you know. But they were saying, but on the other hand, he can have the kindest eyes, and they were talking about. One of the janitors came to the door one day, was looking for a room, or thought he was supposed to do something in that room or something. And they said Joe had just been in this intense stance and this guy came to the room, and they said, in the flicker of an eye, he was just totally tuned into this man, and with the most gracious kind of kindness. And they said his eyes were just, and he talked to him so gently, and you know, not like, hey, you're messing up my lecture, what are you doing here? He said his whole demeanor changed in a moment. So he always had that great capacity for relating to people in terms of his understanding of what was needed. I think you have to look to the world that was in the mid-60s, and there was still this lingering World War II thing, memory, even if people hadn't been immediately involved in the war. There was still
and of course the Korean War had come in there too, but
right, yeah. And there had McCarthy era, and now here was the Civil Rights Movement suddenly in full bloom by the mid-60s. In full bloom. That was in '64 was the Los Angeles riots.
63 was the I Have a Dream speech, I think.
So all of that great social foment in this country, and as a part of that whole feel after life, there was the counterculture that sprang forth, and there was communes across this country, college age, but young adult age, and so people were willing to do different things, but I think the theological revolution was the key one that brought the order into being. I mean, these people in '64, Charles and I, and Joe and Carol Pierce went to the Middle East.
66.
66, I'm sorry.
We moved to Chicago in '64.
Yeah. In '66, we went to the Middle East for 3 months. That included
under assignment.
Under assignment.
Okay.
And that included some time going through Europe and so on. But
to study the Arab world, Tan-Ur, and so forth.
But the main thing I was going to say about that was that we had a summer '65 gathering in Chicago at the Institute, which was a college group of college students, and that's when the first really encompassing religious studies curriculum got born. David McCleskey was just key in that. He just sat reading books and coming up with articles and seminars and stuff all that summer. And that was all. Yeah. Then the following summer, '65, was 66. Summer '66 was a clergy gathering and teachers. And so Charles helped do stuff in that summer. Well, I did too.
Well, didn't you work with the student summer?
Yeah, in '66.
60.
So that's right. Both of us were teaching, so to speak, in that summer. He worked in the clergy, and I worked with the college students. So we had 3 groups: clergy, teachers, and college students in '66. Well, at the end of that, we began to get ready to go to the Middle East immediately. And by the time we got back from the Middle East in December, the place was full of college students, well, of all 3 of those groups, who had taken the order upon themselves.
Right.
So it was a, you know, and that's why I was saying the theological revolution really just unleashed what was already there in those people.
I think at least one thing. I mean, they had been going to church out of obligation and family history and this and that, and then what they found was that this thing that they had been engaged in really had to do with the deeps of their lives, and from the standpoint of not some theoretical thing, but they experienced that they were free to live, and they could go, and also they saw that here was something concrete being done in Fifth City. And then the implication was that this was going to be replicated in other places and so forth. And then weren't quite
And
there
they
yet.
wouldn't be on their own. They would be with a group of people who were out to live a life of service to the world.
Yeah.
And that was they had been released to take on themselves that kind of role. And I don't know how to say what happened interiorly, but
what I hear you saying is very helpful, and just in terms of a certain formula that's coming together, which is that there was this depth hunger that was there, and that they suddenly felt to be addressed in this curriculum, but they also saw that this was not just a theoretical or intellectual exercise, but hey, these people are doing something here in this West Side ghetto, and they're going to do more of it. And the third thing was, and there was this community. I mean, it was it was a group, it was a supportive community, so that they experienced the release from the burden of the weight of the whole world on just them, but they can say, I've got a team. So I mean,
that's right.
Right.
Joe's work, his doctoral work was in sociology of religion or ethics, and this permeated then everything he was out to do. He was out to turn the church on its head, to get it outside its abstract intellectualism and to put it to service for the world. And this was very forthright, and he didn't try to hide any of this. And so people was way beyond intellectualism, and yet they encountered the most rigorous intellectual community that they could imagine. The kind of study that we did, the kind of reflective thinking we did, and all of that always aimed for the sake of service and toward interior rejuvenation.
Well, you've triggered something in my mind that I've reflected on a lot lately, and that is that where there's been new life bursting out, I think you could say this historically, the arts have come to life too, and I just think of the hymnody explosion that early Methodism was. Well, this the music of this community, this people just started writing songs and songs. Now they often use music, almost always use music that was already there, but they were creating songs of all kinds. And this went on for years, and you know this, and you've got you've seen the songbooks or have the songbooks of all of this, and this is they were giving expression to interior happenings with themselves as they did this, and of course, we used it as a device too, as a part of town meetings to create a song about your town or this and that. But people just put out these things.
And it was important that they used the tunes of the day, because when you heard that tune, if you walked through a store, it was not the original lyrics that you began singing, but in your insides you were singing these very secular religious lyrics.
We heard the cry from the past. We heard the cry set forth at last.
See, those are the only words I know.
Joe, part of the ripe history of Joe Matthews was that during seminary days, one of the things he did, and with great intentionality, never thoughtlessly, was to jar people. He was out to get beyond their moralism into a depth morality. And so he used language very intentionally to offend people so that they would have a response, a depth response. And he used particularly, he used dams and hells and things that really wouldn't shock anybody now. I don't think at all.
We'd need to kick it up a notch.
Oh, several notches. But in those days, you know, a seminary professor didn't do that. And he didn't tell dirty stories or anything like that. But he just used language that was offensive. And that's part of the theological address, is the offense. So that one has to deal with something beyond the intellectual. And he used language in very creative, unique ways. You know, he talked about isness, and he, you know, that sort of stuff that just, he used words and language to try to get beyond the head trip.
Yeah. You know, in terms of this trying to break through the set, you know, that very early paper that he did for Motive magazine, the time my father died, and he talks about going in after he gets to the funeral home where they have him, and just getting towels and wet and wiping all the makeup off his face,
and pulling the stuffing out of his cheeks so that he looked like the age he was.
And you know, and just to put that in an article like that, just with, now, you know, that is that you've got to just stop and think, you know, and be given a new opportunity to decide for yourself what all of this means. Well, when we first moved there, they were experimenting with what was called a solitary office. They had the daily office. I mean, the daily office was, but this was a solitary office, and it was having this basic structure and form of the daily office, but it was something you did individually, and and it was done in the evening, and it had a lot of physical motion to it. You'd bow down, and this had movement with it, and the attempt to deal with the solitary dimension.
But it was a corporate solitary.
A corporate solitary, yes. Everybody would go to the chapel at 5 or 5:30 or 6 or whenever it was, and do this on their own. And one would finish early, and someone, you know, I mean, it was just, but, and it wasn't spoken. I mean, you did, this was an...
There was a lot of movement to it. And reading, I suppose, probably.
Yeah. And it, but that didn't last long. That wasn't where it was.
I don't think it lasted more than a month.
And that wasn't where it was. Of course, everything we did was an attempt to keep touch with history and what has been and what has been created, and yet transform it to be of this age. And therefore language often was, the daily office was traditional language, but added, you know, added the whole thing of the public voice and the...
Well, and the instruments.
Yes.
You know, the drums and the gong and the rhythm instruments. But we never...
And the kneeling and the standing and the...
a lot of activity, bodily activity, movement. But we never did singing in the daily office. And I think Joe was, though he was very much for singing these other songs, I think he felt that music was so powerful that it would, maybe, I don't know, this, but somehow I had this idea that it would kind of overshadow everything else, and he was not ready to have that happen.
When you reflect back on your actual life at that actual time, how would you talk about the role that daily office actually played in your life at that time? And did it play a role, or was it
maybe not so much initially for me? Prayers did. Prayers were always an address on me, other people's prayers, and my decision to pray on a given day. That was more an address. Later on, and I suppose the witness too. The witness,
I was going to say that.
the same way. Some I almost still remember. When they were really a witness to life and the giver of life and taker of life. And then, but the daily office remained very much a part of my consciousness for a long time. Longer than some other people who said, it's time to change this, let's get over this. More maybe having it address a happening during the day. I was always finding myself going about,
Exactly.
if I were working out in the world, or something would occur and I would find myself in dialogue with something from the daily office. It might have been a piece of scripture, it may have been a prayer, it may have been, that caused me to reflect more deeply on the moment and the address of the moment on my life than otherwise would have happened. I don't know how else to say it, but I think that was really critical, and it could be just the passing of the peace.
Yeah.
But the fact of this kind of everyday, day in and day out, every day kind of participation in a corporate act of worship continued to be important to me in what happened interiorly in my life, as long as we did it.
Yeah. And just to follow on and touch on to this, my experience was very similar to this, and I think one of the triggers that will not go into all of what happened the last 3 or 4 years that we were around, but one of the triggers that finally just sort of led me to leave the order and the institute was we were in the Houston house the last 2 years, and this was after the Council of 1984, when just things were totally reconstructed, and we didn't have daily office. We had some residue from, I wasn't in the summer with Gene Houston and the other kind of, quote, new age things. I wasn't in that, but in the Houston house, we'd start, we'd do a morning dance, music and dance, and and look in each other's eyes and go forward and come back and so forth. And it just left me. I guess I really had become ingrained in the daily office, and I found it very difficult to take that step.
And probably that's simply an indication of how important it was to shift. But
oh yeah, that's true.
Because we also did, I can't remember what, we were reading something at that time and doing a reflective journal in the morning. And even though I was irritated that we weren't doing the daily office, I found that was some of the greatest reflective work that I had probably ever done. Day in and day out, I found things, my responses as very, very important. So, you know, I think we were representative of the most conservative of the conservative. In some ways, the best use of that word around, and not willing to look it straight in the eye.
You know, it's interesting. In the midst of that, I had we were in India there for 2 years toward the end of our time. And we had an alternative kind of office that we did there because of the Hindus and the Muslims that were in the house, and the nexus that we were in, and so forth. And I think they had created that earlier. I think Slicker had a big hand in doing that. And that was not a problem for me.
Used Tagore poetry.
Yeah. And
we used pretty much the form of the daily office or the Geneva. You know,
yeah.
And how was it received by the indigenous folks?
I think fine.
Yeah.
They were mystified by the whole thing, even though we understood them to be part of the order, and they were pretty mystified about what was going on, because they had come in through Navagram Prayas. They had come in through the village work and through 8-week training or whatever it was, and whatever was there in the spirit was not overtly religious, for sure. And anyway, but they were fine with it, you know.
Yeah.
Whatever we did, they were fine with it.
But you were fine with the structure and the feel of it, even though the language had been changed.
It wasn't not self-consciously Christian language at all, you know.
But the form was there, and the witness was still there. I can't remember the prayers, but I presume they were there.
I presume they were too, that there was some kind of prayers.
Maybe not,
I can't recall exactly. And but I had a reason, I think, for understanding that, and that we weren't trying to force some Christian system on these Muslims and Hindus, and that was not a problem for me.
I do want to say something else about that, because I think, we had the rituals and that sort of thing on the one hand, but being under assignment and the way we structured pedagogy, because learning to teach the courses was learning to go through the exercise of addressing the deep of other people's lives, and thereby your own. And I think that probably affected the interior, the life of people as much or more than daily office ever did. And then just being under assignment, you know, that's something that people don't like. Nobody likes being under assignment. And to take that was in some ways to swallow a pill, and yet we understood that to be who we were. The whole business of economic discipline. You can't divorce the interior life of our group from the kind of economic discipline of living on a stipend. So what's that? That's political, economic, and cultural. We've touched everything now.
Learning what you learned in all of that teaching and pedagogy. You learned how to listen for what was in the midst of what somebody was saying or responding in a seminar, to hear what's behind it, what are they really saying, where are they hurting, where's that kind of thing, which a lot of people have developed on their own, but not self-consciously.
And teaching was really, it certainly was required intellectual rigor, but finally somebody in one of those courses was over against the humanity, the spirit depths of the teacher. You were in an encounter like this, and the people who never got that never were excelled in teaching. If they thought it was a matter of memorizing stuff or learning to do charting, or which it was, but finally it was just raw spirit that you were dealing with, and that's, you contrast that with what goes on in a church today, and not many people who are up leading leadership roles understand this at all. Even in pedagogy, there was always the aspect of witness. And the lectures, when they were really, really good lectures, were things that you were coughing up out of your own experience. And, we used each other's illustrations and so on, but if people did that, unless somehow it reflected their own deeps, it was nothing.
Authenticity versus inauthenticity.
Yeah. And
same words.
So all of that was extremely important in getting to the deeps of things. We actually talked about ourselves as a teaching order early on. That was very much where the sort of door to this castle. Then there were lots of other things that emerged, of course. Well, one of the other things that I had thought about in our earlier conversation, but it's just the use of time, the time design that we followed. Whatever, and that evolved, changed now and then, 3 days, what, morning, evening, night, or whatever, I don't know, or 2 days, or 2 weeks, or 2 weeks in one.
Week 1, week 2.
All of that, I think, and we experimented in so many different ways, but it was very freeing to see that you could be intentional with your time. Now, I feel pretty much like a slob in that relationship now, really. I mean, I don't feel like I use my time very well.
But you're conscious of the weight of it, is what I hear you saying too.
Yeah.
I mean, just as
I make lists and that sort of thing, try to get accomplishments accomplished, but that doesn't have, that's, but I remember when we very first went to Chicago, I was doing teaching in the public schools, day-to-day substitution. And so I wasn't around for Caligula. And but I just remember Charles saying, wow, it's so freeing to be up and see that you can have a day's work done by 7:30 in the morning, and 8 or whatever, 9. Anyway, but I think that somehow was a part of the interior life that, and then just the corporate life, that you had to, whatever happened, you did consciously in the face of your neighbor. And that always forced great interior kind of reflection. Trying consciously to live in the comprehensive, in the universal. And we did that in so many ways, but it was integral to our self-understanding that we tried to see ourselves in the context of the big picture. The kind of work we did with the world grid, where we had 9 continents, broke that down into 3s and 3s, and an effort to see how the world, no one escapes being in this picture, and that all of these are related, historically, culturally, no matter how different they are, and we are part of the big picture. I think for me that's key to for anybody to see that, to think that living a soft life or having plenty of money is what it's all about. You take them by the hand and walk them to Africa, some way or other. Now, that's presuming one point of view. How you do that with the African is really the same, I think. Helping that kid to see themselves in the comprehensive picture and to see that they are related. Tribalism is not adequate. That's one piece of it, I think.
Trigger off of that same thing, maybe stating it a little bit different. I experience today myself as one with all that is. I really experienced that today in a way that I haven't ever before in my life, to this extent. I've just sat here, and that tree over there with the big leaves has just been talking to me and saying hello, and I'm one with it, and that's not some. And I have not understood the whole business of people being vegetarians, because I see the weakness in it. It only takes in hand the animal world and not this world here. But I still have have an increased appreciation for that stance, and it's a part. It just shocks me daily that the world about me speaks to me. And I understand I'm one with it. I'm one with it. That's awfully hard to say when you're quite aware that you have your own identity, and yet there's this other dimension. And that's an important development in my life in the last 10, 20 years, I would think. I think.
And that's something that we didn't deal with in the order, in the Institute. We were very much people-oriented. And to talk about ecology, to talk about saving the trees, to talk about petting Gretzky, that was just, and I expect partly Joe didn't know that life in some ways, but also I think he knew that it could so easily take your eye off the concerns of the human world. But to see those now, apart from this world of trees and toadstools and slugs and Charles and I are very much on the same page, and I think the kind of pivotal point in our lives after we left Houston House was when when we got a dog. And you know, we both had dogs growing up, but never related to them the way that they were always outside dogs. There was a certain culture of the way you treated a dog or mistreated dogs or ignored dogs and so on. But here we got this miniature poodle who was an in-house dog, and he became our teacher in terms of the rest of the world. And he even came to Bloomington with us. But that, certainly for me, and I think for both of us, he was a really pivotal key in our embracing the world at large, the totality of it. I'd want him to work in a soup kitchen sometime, you know, I mean every day, but I'd really want him to have to deal with kids that were hurting. I mean, you'd love to take them on a trip through India or Africa, but that certainly is all here, and so you really wouldn't have to do that.
I'd like to sit down and just talk with them about looking at Gretzky here, or people I encounter at the Y, that just every human being is sheer mystery. You see them, they are a mystery, and you see the responses they make and how they talk and so forth, and it's just a wonder. And you just think, you know, I don't know what's there. I'm just, it's perpetual revealing. And the same thing with that cat. And the same thing with that caterpillar that fell a while ago down on my pants, and that I took my pen out and knocked it off because I didn't know if it really, if that fuzzy stuff was sticky and poisonous or not. But it's a wonder. And just to see the mystery and the oneness. The mystery in everything and the oneness with everything at the same time. And it's just and I don't know what the ritual is for doing that, except just talking and letting somebody look at things and talking with them.
It might be the same with saying that you want to have encounter people who are in different races, different economic thing. I mean, the same is true. You'd have to have some kind of a reflective conversation that that made sense out of it, or at least not made sense, but helped them to internalize it. A journal, maybe, for a kid would be,
Absolutely.
I think, a key tool.
Yes.
If you had poetry to go along with it, all the better, you know. Piece of poetry or
Song.
song, fiction, whatever. Reflective tools like
Exactly.
that would be an important part of the process. The fact of living I don't know how Mary Ellen thinks about this child she's bringing into the world.
Absolutely.
It's one of the most scariest time in all of creation, and it cannot be simply soccer and swimming or how we're going to let these trees continue in history is no small question. And Rob Work, I just looked at a little clip that he did for a group recently, and he said, this is me talking, he said, I say, and maybe he was saying somebody else says, I don't know, that the decade we are entering upon is the most critical decade in all of the history of this planet. And he said, and I'm very much aware that the history goes back billions of years. So to say that this decade is the most critical one is no small thing to say. And unless what the East and the West do interiorly relates them to the totality of the planet and the necessity of acting immediately and swiftly, this kind of a question, I think from Rob's perspective, and really from mine, is an interesting intellectual exercise, but not germane to the future of humankind and the slugs and the hickory trees. We either figure it out quickly, and I say this in the context of the question about service.
Yeah.
We figure it out quickly and put our lives on the line for it. Or, you know, the warming planet is just too obvious a thing to ignore. And I don't have any idea whether an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, not a spill, but an eruption, has anything to do with the warming planet. I don't know, may or may not, but this stuff is Question is, what is your interior made of? And how are you going to relate that consciousness to recreating the planet? And it has to do with the spirit life, but it has to do with the exterior too. And I said to Aaron a couple of years ago, we were in Seattle this time of year, a little earlier in April, and he was saying that the father of one of his roommates at the University of Michigan, housemates, was an engineer. And that he said that, global warming was not necessarily created by us, blah, blah. And so he said, who did you say he was an engineer with? Well, with General Motors. And I said, look, Aaron, I find that I'm called upon to apologize to you and all of your generation, because I received this world. I came into it in 1931, and it was still a very pristine planet, in almost every way. The rivers and the lakes and the fish and agriculture. You didn't worry about pesticides because we didn't have pesticides. We had more trees than anybody could have, and my generation trashed that. I don't know whether he heard that or not, but it's a genuine kind of confession on my part, and how to turn that around, how to say, well, look, 10 years I'm going to be gone, you're going to have to deal with it. Sorry. I still think that that's the pressing question of for my grandchildren.